Now I realize I want to introduce our next speaker by helping you to understand how important it is that we somehow open the doors of the closed minds of most of the people that we come in contact with. Because let's face it, we're in a minority. Those of us that have decided to take the red pill and we're living outside of the matrix are trying to teach the people that took the blue pill to understand that they can change their minds. Now, most people go through their lives with an exclamation point over their head. That's because they know. I saw it on TV. Bill O'Reilly told me. I heard it on the radio. Lush Bimbo told me. Sean Insanity told me. I know they would never lie to me. Well, you know what? When you've got an exclamation point over your head, that is a declaration of knowing. And when you know, the doors to your mind are closed. You can't get through. So how do you open that door? Okay? I mean, if you're going to try to tell somebody the truth about what's going on, the truth about the Federal Reserve, the truth about the IRS, the truth about 9/11, whatever, you can't start off by saying, hey, Bob, let me tell you what really happened on 9/11. See, the question is, now picture this question in your mind. I want you to picture the blackboard and follow the bouncing ball. If the official story of 9/11 is a lie, then what really happened? It starts off with if, blah, 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 followed by then, blah, 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 blah. If you start off your conversation saying, well, let me tell you what really happened, they're not going to listen because you haven't established the if. They've got to get the if in their head that they've been lied to. So how do you get them to doubt their perception of the world? I'm going to tell you how to do it right now. Now, this is extremely important that you understand how this works. All right. On a scale of 1 to 10, think in your mind, how much do you trust the media to tell you the truth? And ask your buddy, ask Bob this. Hey, Bob, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you trust the government to tell you the truth? Bob will probably say, oh, man, 3. You give it 2, yeah, right. Most of us give flat 0. But seriously, most Americans, when you ask them, how much do you trust the media to tell you the truth, they're going to say 3 or 4. And I have a chart I'll show a little bit later on during my presentation. It's actually a little bit lower than that. So say, okay, fine, you give them a 3. Now, next question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you trust the federal government to tell you the truth? Oh, now you're going to get a 1 or a 0. Okay, next question. If you took an exam and scored a 3 or a 30%, would you pass or fail? I'd fail. If you scored a 1 or a 10%, would you pass or fail? Fail. All right, fine. So now we're on even ground here. Now you've convinced Bob that you're both agreeing that the media lies to you and the government lies to you. Next question. Where does America, including all of us, Bob, where do we get all of our official information? He stops. He thinks. From the media and the government. So if we can agree that the media's lied to you and the government's lied to you and we build our opinions of the world based upon those lies, doesn't it stand to reason that our opinions are extensions of the lie? And therefore, does that not mean that we're living in a matrix? Now, all of a sudden, that door is coming open a little bit. They're starting to realize that everything he's been told is a freaking lie. Say, do you believe everything they told you on the television? He's not going to admit it now. Say, Bob, do you believe everything that they told you about what happened on September 11th? Do you believe that 19 hijackers took over those planes and flew 3 of them with laser-guided precision into towers that most pilots admit couldn't happen? Bob, let me tell you what really happened. See how that works? We have to utilize this particular methodology. You have to knock down their wall. You have to open that door, replace that exclamation point with a question mark. Because only when that question mark appears over their head can you get through to some of these brain-dead sheeple that have been force-fed propaganda for most of their lives. And you have to, once you've got that question mark over their head, then they're going to be open to accept alternative information. And that's when you can take a copy of the American Free Press and put it in their hand, and all of a sudden they just might get it. The American Free Press was formerly known as the Spotlight newspaper, and of course it's been attacked and shunned by anybody that wants to promote the conventional wisdom of the official story of anything. But folks, there are very few publications in this country right now that have the guts to print the alternative information. And one of the reporters that's been out there pounding the pavements, beating the feet to the street, doing it really sweet, keeping it neat, is our next speaker, Mr. Mike Piper. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Piper. Hold on to your hats, folks. This is going to be a good one.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Good to see you.
You too, bud.
Yeah, better fix me up here.
There you go.
Well, I appreciate that introduction. I do want to ask right off the bat here, how many people here are subscribers to American Free Press? Okay, well that's a good number, but you all should be. Here is American Free Press, one of the 2 latest issues right here. I have articles in them. The latest one, March 31st, it's an article about John McCain's recent trip to London. They had a fundraiser for him in London. You know who held the fundraiser? Lord Jacob Rothschild, right. That should tell you everything you need to know about John McCain. And I'm here to tell you, Lord Rothschild is not going to hold a fundraiser for Barack Obama. I have another article in this issue of American Free Press dated March 24th about the story of Admiral Fallon. Now, isn't it interesting, for the last, when we invade Iraq, 2003, since 2003, we have heard this constant refrain from President George W. Bush, support our troops. Well, here is the head of the Central Command in that part of the world where we are now fighting. That leader of the troops stood up to the Bush administration and said, I don't want to support our troops in the way you want to support our troops. He said, I don't want our troops in a war against Iran. And what happened to Admiral Fallon? Admiral Fallon is out of a job. Well, I'll tell you what. Now, this is my opinion, not the opinion of American Free Press. And let me add here and now that everything I'm about to say here today is my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of American Free Press, but I am advocating that you read American Free Press. My opinion is that, sadly enough, this country has reached a point where, as much as we would pray that the electoral process will bring us a return to our constitutional republic, I don't believe that's going to happen, because I think that our electoral system is so controlled. The people who control the media control the vote count, and therefore they do control our election process. I think that the only hope for America, and this is what we must pray for, we must not encourage the military to do it. We must not talk to soldiers and say, do this. We must not go to Admiral Fallon and advocate that he do this, because guess what? We could be prosecuted for that. However, we still do have the First Amendment and the right to religion, freedom of religion in this country. So I want to tell you what I pray. I pray that the American military will finally decide that enough is enough, and that there will be no more wars for Israel, which is exactly what this war in Iraq was all about. Right. And that is exactly what they want a war in Iran to be about. That our military, if President Bush orders an attack on Iran, or for that matter, any other country that doesn't need to be attacked, I pray that our military will roll down Pennsylvania Avenue and arrest this man that I believe to be a war criminal. I pray that our American military will then turn around and come up Capitol Hill, which is where I live, and go to the U.S. Capitol building and arrest every member of Congress who supports the President of the United States in attempting to get us into another needless foreign war. That's my prayer. That's my prayer. I'm not approaching the military and telling them or encouraging them to do this, but I pray to God that this will happen. Incidentally, you know, the last time I was here in Orange County, in fact, the last several times I've been in Orange County, there have been determined efforts to prevent me personally from speaking, along with a lot of other people. The last time I was here in Orange County in October, we held a conference called No More Wars for Israel, and Dennis Whipple, who's one of the videographers here today, put together this assembly of what happened at that conference, even though there were very determined efforts to stop that conference from happening. So if you go to the table at the very back of the room, I believe, next to where Dan Pilla's table is, you can get copies of this, and I think Dennis has the capacity to make more copies of it. It is the No More Wars for Israel conference. That was in October. We were actually forced out of the hotel where we were in because of pressure from the leading fascist group on American soil, a group called the Anti-Defamation League. And while, you know, I know a lot of you have heard of the Anti-Defamation League, a lot of people think that the ADL's only concern is people who criticize Israel. No, I'm here to tell you, and I used to know the ADL's top spy. He used to come to conferences all the time. He used to visit me at Liberty Lobby's office in Washington. In fact, I've written a couple chapters about those experiences with the ADL and with the history of the ADL in my book, The Judas Goats, which is back there at the Barnes Review and Spotlight, or American Free Press table. Here is the Barnes Review magazine, by the way. How many of you subscribe to the Barnes Review? Not enough of you. You can't know about what's going on in our world today without understanding what has happened in our history, and this is the magazine that sets the history straight 6 times a year. In any case, this fascist group, the Anti-Defamation League, is concerned about any and all people who have political opinions that run contrary to the powers that be in this country. There's a lot of people think, oh, well, I only deal with the gun issue, or I only deal with school prayer, or I only deal with the tax issue. I'm here to tell you that if you have any position on any issue that seems contrary to the ruling elite in this country, the Anti-Defamation League keeps a file on you. They know what you're up to. You know who they used to spy on? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, I know there's a lot of you out there saying, well, you know, Martin Luther King did this and Martin Luther King did that. But I guarantee you that they were keeping an eye on him because they didn't trust him. I'll tell you who else they spied on. Another good friend of Martin Luther King's who happens to be an acquaintance of mine. I don't call him a friend of mine. He's an acquaintance. I've met him several times. Is Dick Gregory, the famous comic. Dick Gregory did a Freedom of Information Act search of his own FBI files years ago. And you know what Dick Gregory discovered when he did that search? He discovered that a lot of the information that was in the FBI files about him had been given to the FBI by agents of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. So this is a private spy agency, which of course is affiliated with Israel's intelligence service, but it's a private spy agency that has an agenda that runs contrary to all dissident political thought in this country. We have to keep that in mind. You know, there's a lot of people who say that America is turning fascist. I often have some problems with that because the fascism we have in this country today has absolutely no relationship to the fascism of Germany or the fascism of Italy. But in a particular sense, I suppose, it's correct to call what George Bush and these criminal elements that he's associated with, it's appropriate to call it fascist. But that brings up another point that I'm here to make. And you know, there's the old saying about Dale Carnegie, how to win friends and influence people. I'm not here to win any friends, but I do hope I influence some people here today. Because I've been doing this, writing and speaking, more than half my life, which is kind of scary. I started working for the Spotlight when I was not quite 20 years old, and now I'm 48. That's pretty scary when I look back on it. Well, I'm not quite 48 yet, but a few months. In any case, in those years, and they are years of real experience because I've met literally thousands of people all over the United States and more recently around the world, but I'm concerned about here in the United States. I've met people from different organizations, different points of view. Believe me, I've read hundreds of newsletters, and this was even before the era of the computer. So I'm very familiar with a lot of the literature and the writing that appears in this amorphous movement. And there's so many realms to this movement with different opinions and different aspects, different perspectives. And I'm not here to argue with that because, thank God, despite the efforts of the Anti-Defamation League and these other criminal elements in this country, we still do have freedom of speech. Although I'm here to assure you that they are doing their damnedest to eliminate it in every way possible. And the Patriot Act is a first step in that direction. And we have them to thank for that. Or maybe I should say blame for that. But needless to say, one of the most serious problems that we have in our movement, in the freedom movement, in the truth movement, in the nationalist movement, whatever you want to call it, one of the most serious problems is the fact we have a lot of people, no, I shouldn't say a lot of people, we have a small number of people who have, over the years, deliberately created fraudulent stories and put them into circulation because they thought those stories were helpful. The problem with it is some of these stories sound really good and they take on a life of their own, and we repeat the stories over and over and over again, and then new people hear them, and now with the advent of the internet, this information is all over there. Well, you know, American Free Press says the media is the enemy, which is indeed it is. It's in the contextual institutional sense, there's no bigger enemy we have than the media. But we can be our own worst enemy by continuing to circulate stories that are not true simply because they sound good. There's another problem, and I want to talk about that a little bit more later, but there's another problem we have too. We have to start looking at the world in the context of this 21st century. There have been changes in society. There have been changes in outlook. We have countries on the face of the planet today that didn't exist prior to, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. It's a whole new world out there. And I'm here to tell you, a lot of us for years and years said, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S. That sounded good at the time, and it made a lot of sense at the time. And in those days, the United Nations, for better, well, I shouldn't say for better or for worse, because there's a lot of negatives about the United Nations. But I'm here to tell you, folks, forget about the old myth that the it wasn't a myth, but it is a myth now. It's no mas, no more. The United Nations is not the New World Order. I'm here to tell you that the people who are trying to put a New World Order in place, a global plantation, as Willis Carto, the founder of Liberty Lobby, always called it, the people who are behind the New World Order have latched on to the United States, and they are using the United States to enforce the New World Order. The people who you hear about in the mass media as villains, foreign leaders, they may not be nice guys, they may be dictators, but I'm here to tell you that if you hear about them in the mass media that they're villains, you know what that means? That means they are standing up against the New World Order. That means that they represent forces that are standing in opposition to the mass media in the United States. That's why the mass media tells you that President Ahmadinejad of Iran is the new Hitler. That's why the mass media in the United States tells you that President Chavez of Venezuela is a communist. He's a socialist. Well, you might recall that it was the Chavez government of Venezuela that gave an open forum to William Rodriguez to be able to go down there and speak freely in that country about 9/11. What has our great democratic government done here? What has our media done here? You know, the one story about 9/11, there's a lot of stuff you can hear about 9/11, but all you need to know about 9/11 and the fact that what we've been told is a lie is the personal testimony of William Rodriguez. Absolutely. I've heard all the stories. I've been on all the websites. I've read the books. I've seen the videos. I'm here to tell you his personal testimony, his singular experience proves that it's a lie. I've told that to my personal friends and who never attend conferences like this or who never watch alternative videos. That's the truth, ladies and gentlemen. So we had the Chavez government. He's one of the worst villains in the world, according to the mass media in America. Even now, notice this. You know, I'm sorry if there's any members of the John Birch Society here, but I'm going to criticize the John Birch Society. And you know, I said I wasn't here to win friends. I'm here to influence people. So I am going to criticize the John Birch Society. A few months ago, a year ago maybe, I saw the John Birch Society's magazine, whole big spread about Vladimir Putin. Oh my God, he's a communist. Oh my God, he's a former KGB agent. He's getting ready to bring us the New World Order. Well, guess what? The John Birch Society, which has been telling us for years how bad the Council on Foreign Relations is, and that's right, the Council on Foreign Relations is bad. The John Birch Society is echoing the very line about Vladimir Putin that's coming out of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations says that Vladimir Putin is a bad man. The mass media in the United States is telling you that Vladimir Putin is a bad man. So why, all these years the John Birch Society has been saying, watch out for what you read in the mass media, then why all of a sudden is what the mass media is saying about Vladimir Putin correct in the eyes of the John Birch Society? Well, the fact is, Vladimir Putin is a bad man in the eyes of the mass media for one reason and one reason alone. He is a nationalist. And in the eyes of the New World Order, nationalism is wrong. Looking out for the interests of your own nation or your own peoples is wrong. They want us to be one world under their control. But Vladimir Putin and the Russians say, no, we want to be our own leaders. And the people of Venezuela say that too. And guess who else said it too? A guy named Saddam Hussein. That's why we went to war against Saddam Hussein. He was standing up for his nation's interests. You may not like the way he ran that country. You may not like what he did to people. And how do you know everything you've heard about him is true? Because we all know we can't believe the mass media. That's why there are independent voices like American Free Press. That's why there's a Republic Broadcasting Network, which I do a radio show on every night. That's why we need meetings like this, alternative information for people to be able to talk openly and freely about things. Now, I want to talk real quickly here about a couple things, and I'm going to wrap it up. I told Payman, you know, we're running behind time, and I just wrap it up. But I want to talk about, who's heard about Reverend Wright, Obama's pastor? You know what I've been calling him lately? Reverend Very, Very Right, and that's upset a lot of people. Now, there's a reason why I call him Reverend Very, Very Right. Now, let me tell you why. I mean, this said that I was going to talk about I will share with you the major news events of the year that the major media did not tell you. Well, I'm doing that now. This is news. Okay. Reverend Wright. Here's one of his statements. Now, okay, here's what he said. White greed has created the world's problems. Now, when you hear that in the mass media, if you're white, your immediate reaction is, oh my God, Reverend Wright's a racist. He said white greed has created the world's problems. Well, do you know how many black politicians and black preachers in this country have said things like that over the years? Lots of them. But why all of a sudden is the mass media focusing on Reverend Wright? This guy's an obscure preacher in Chicago. Well, of course we know why. It's because he's a friend, obviously a very close friend of Barack Obama. Okay. That having been said, I just want to talk about that statement he made. White greed has created the world's problems. Well, You know, if you look at the problems we have here today, look at the black problem in America. Look at the race relations problem in America. I mean, black on black crime, black on white crime. I live in Washington, D.C., so I talk with authority about this. Drug problems, a horrible, horrible law enforcement system that puts people in this endless cycle of in and out of prison and probation and so forth. Well, you know what? I think Reverend Wright is right when he said that white greed created the world's problems, because white greed had a lot to do with the slave system that brought these blacks to America and made the problem. You know, I mean, if you can get people to work for you for free, in chains and with guns at their head, and you can do it, there's a certain amount of greed there. So you see, Reverend Wright was not that wrong, but they're playing this up because they're trying to stop Barack Obama. Why are they trying to stop Barack Obama? Well, it's very simple, because they suddenly discovered that Barack Obama is kind of a black nationalist, and he's associated with someone who is a black nationalist. And what amazes me is that there's so many white nationalists in this country who are all of a sudden mad about the fact that there's a black nationalist. It never occurred to them maybe they could work together in trying to break the back of these New World Order forces that want to hold us all in chains. Maybe it's time they need to work together instead of against each other. There's another problem here too. They said, listen to this. They said that, I heard this on the news here when I was out here. They said, Reverend Wright said, oh my God, the Israelis and the South Africans are working for an ethnic bomb to kill blacks and Arabs. We hear that in the mass media and you say, oh, how could he say something like that? Nothing could be further from the truth. Well, I have a little bit of experience in this matter of an ethnic bomb. Because a few years ago, I gave a little speech over in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and I talked about the fact that Israel was working on an ethnic bomb. Well, the group that I mentioned earlier, this fascist group, the Anti-Defamation League, they put out a press release, and it's been all over the internet, that this horrible, horrible Mike Piper had told this horrible lie that Israel was working on an ethnic bomb that would kill only Arabs. So now when people hear about Mike Piper, someone wants to write a news story about Mike Piper in our beloved mainstream press, they say, he says that Israel is building an ethnic bomb. Well, you know where I got that story? I got that story out of the London Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, one of the most devoted supporters of Israel on the face of this planet, and it was written by an Israeli correspondent for the London Times. So obviously Reverend Wright heard that story somewhere, somehow, and he's telling the story too. And he's being presented as this horrible hate monger who's telling these horrible lies, just as the Anti-Defamation League said that about me. But Reverend Wright was right. I'm sorry to bring you that news, but that's the truth. And you know, I tell you, here's another story about Reverend Wright. We heard about what he said after 9/11, the chickens came home to roost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody was upset about it. And I can understand why people were upset about it. But I want to tell you what somebody else said after 9/11. Now remember, Reverend Wright is this relatively obscure black minister in Chicago whom none of us would have ever heard about had it not been for this mass media, which tells us the truth all the time. Right after 9/11, actually on March 4th, 2002, a gentleman gave a speech and said this: one of the reasons I believe the spiritual door was opened for an attack against the United States of America is that the policy of our government has been to ask the Israelis and demand it with pressure not to retaliate in a significant way against the terrorist strikes that have been launched against them. What that means is the reason why the United States was attacked was because the United States was not nice enough to Israel over the years, and therefore, as a consequence of that, God opened the spiritual door, and that's why 9/11 was attacked. Well, you know, it wasn't an obscure black minister from Chicago who said that. It was Senator James Inhofe, a conservative Republican U.S. Senator from Oklahoma. A member of the United States Senate said that. Now, unless you were on the internet or read my book, The High Priests of War, or maybe saw it somewhere else mentioned, that was never in the mass media. And yet this is a highly respected leader of the so-called Christian right in the U.S. Senate. Now, that was his explanation for 911. Now, maybe some of you believe that. I feel sorry if you do. Maybe you think he's right. Well, I think he's wrong. But needless to say, I think you should, whatever you feel about that, I think you should consider why the media chooses to focus on one thing over here and yet will choose to disregard something else on the other side. Why has the media refused to tell us the story of William Rodriguez? They tell us what a hero he is, and he's truly a hero. But they don't tell you that this hero has raised serious questions about the official story about 911 that's been passed on by our mass media. Our mass media, ladies and gentlemen, they are totally, thoroughly corrupt. They are totally, thoroughly corrupt. The mass media, the media monopoly should be broken up, should be taken out of the hands of the people that control it. I don't know, sold off to the employees or sold off to independent companies, but it should be taken away from the people that control it, because the media is the enemy, as American Free Press has said. Now, just a couple more things here. I'm taking even longer than I said I was going to take, but I'm going to wrap it up real quickly. Talked earlier about some of these stories that are just not true, that are circulating out there. They sound good, and I'm going to touch on this one because I know it touches on an issue that many of you are interested in. The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a corrupt monopoly that should be abolished. I agree with that 100%. But I'm here to tell you something. The last issuance of U.S. notes did not come about in 1963. U.S. notes were released into the economy after the death of JFK. I have held them in my hands. Now, that story about JFK withdrawing U.S. notes from circulation, many people say that was one of the reasons why he was assassinated. Folks, there was a federal law that was in existence for many, many years which required that every so many years U.S. notes be issued into the economy. And that was done automatically by the Treasury at the direction of that U.S. law. Now, there's a little twist to this. You know, that story has been in circulation for a long, long time, and when people hear me saying, well, you shouldn't, that story came from the Spotlight newspaper. Well, folks, let me tell you something. The Spotlight newspaper picked that story up from an obscure newsletter and put it in a little item about this big. The next issue of the Spotlight newspaper, after the issue had been thoroughly researched, the Spotlight ran a correction saying that story's not true and we apologize for running that. But the original story, which had been taken from another newsletter, has been widely circulated for many, 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 many years. I have seen it reprinted in dozens of books, hundreds of newsletters. It's probably available in thousands of places on the internet. But it's not true. Now, when people talk about the JFK assassination, they say, oh, well, Jim Marrs in his book Crossfire has written about it. Well, yeah, but if you look in Jim Marrs' book Crossfire, guess what he cites as the source? The Spotlight newspaper. You see, folks, it gets very, very circular, and it sounds good. The story sounds good, but it's not true. It is true the Kennedy family wanted to abolish the Federal Reserve. It's true that the Kennedy family had intentions in that regard. How do I know that? Not something I read on the internet. A very good friend of mine, the late DeWest Hooker, knew John F. Kennedy's father, had business dealings with him. John F. Kennedy's father told him that one of the ultimate aims of the Kennedy family was to move against the Federal Reserve. But the issuance of U.S. notes, folks, I'm sorry to tell you, that executive order we hear about doesn't even have to do with U.S. notes. The executive order has to do with silver certificates. So you see, it's a good story, but it's not true. Another real quick one here. Jim Traficant, congressman from Ohio. You know, how many of you know who Jim Traficant was? Okay, good man, you know, and he's still in prison. Reason why he's still in prison is because he won't accept clemency. Reason why he won't accept clemency is that requires for him to admit that he committed the crimes that he didn't commit. I have a book coming out on Traficant's case, and I'm here to tell you he was framed through and through, lock, stock, and barrel. But I don't want to talk about that. That's a story for another time, and it's an incredible story. But I'm here to tell you that there's a famous speech by Jim Traficant that's cited as being in the congressional record. And on such and such a date, that Jim Traficant got up there and said that the United States was in hock to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was an illegal money monopoly, all of which is true. And this story, this speech by Jim Traficant, he never gave this speech. He never gave this speech. He probably believes what they say he said, but somebody very carefully crafted that speech. And it's on the internet. If you go out there to the Business Center and look up a speech, look up Jim Traficant, and he never gave the speech. And you know what? Do you tell people, well, he didn't give the speech? They say, oh, well, they probably took it out of the congressional record. You see, folks, my point is this. I'm a stickler for detail. When I write, I try to thoroughly document everything that I do, because what I do in particular, the particular subjects that I write about, and I haven't talked that much about those subjects here today, they're very controversial, and I want to be able to cite my sources on it. And I think if you have enough truth, enough facts, enough real information, that you don't need to create phony stories. And if you ever have doubts about a story, don't repeat it because it sounds good, because it'll come back and bite you. You see, we have enough truth on our side. Now, we don't need fiction, we don't need fantasy to be able to make our point. That's so important. It's something that I try to drive home. It's something that gets a lot of people upset, but that's just the way it is. You know, people call me an investigative reporter. I wouldn't call myself an investigative reporter. Basically, you can find pretty much what's going on with a little bit of discerning research on your own part. I tell you what, when I read the Washington Post, and I'm absolutely serious about this, or the New York Times, I look at the headline, and then I go to the end of the story and see what's in the story, and then I backtrack through the middle of the story, and then I read it from beginning to end. Good example, one time I remember reading, there was a story about one of these suspicious airplane crashes or airplane incidents. The last paragraph of the story about this particular one mentioned that there were like 200 to 300 Egyptian military officers on board that plane. Now, that might have been something you might want to put up in the opening lines of the story just to, maybe let people know that, out of all the people in the plane, there was, kind of one group, a military group in a controversial country. That was buried in the last paragraph in the lead story about that in the Washington Post. And to this day, I don't know if the Washington Post ever mentioned it again. Zacarias Moussaoui, the famed 19th hijacker, despite everything you heard about him regarding 9/11, the Washington Post, the leading newspaper in the country, even barring the New York Times, reported in its gossip section, in a personality profile of Zacarias Moussaoui, that Moussaoui had been charging that the FBI had been following him long before 9/11. That's in the gossip section of the Washington Post. So, you can get the truth out there if you dig, if you take as many sources as possible. This idea of investigative reporters, they are few and far between. The ones that you hear about in the mass media, they're usually propagandists who've been fed their information. It's all out there. That's why I don't call myself an investigative reporter, and I would actually urge you to be conscious of anyone who does, because they're pulling a fast one on you. I'm going to close up by mentioning a book that I'd like you to read, and it's not a book by me. It's a book by a biased professor, kind of a liberal-oriented professor. It's a book about my longtime boss, Willis Carto, and it's back there available on that table from the Barnes Review and American Free Press, kind of back there with a pretty blonde lady and the brunette are sitting. I think I just saw her wave her arm. This book, Willis Carto and the American Far Right, it's a history of Liberty Lobby and American Free Press. There's even a picture of me in there with President Ahmadinejad of Iran. But I'll tell you what's the most interesting thing, I think, in this book. You know, Willis was in the military during World War II in Japan and in the Pacific. At one point, he was hit by a bullet that if it just moved 1 inch left, it would hit his heart. Well, some of you have been in the military, you know, you have these close calls. But on another occasion, as a first scout, you know, up there in the front lines, you know, a Japanese soldier threw a hand grenade at Willis, but exploded and it did no harm. Now, you know, folks, you know, I'll tell you what, I'm not a real religious person, but I do have a very strong belief in greater powers beyond our comprehension, but which we can reach through prayer. And I have to think that, you know, a lot of people go into the military, they never see bullets flying anywhere. Thank God for that. But twice, Japanese soldiers tried to kill Willis Carto and failed. And you know why I think that's so interesting? That is so interesting because here's this guy who had all the reason in the world to hate the Japanese. They even put a bullet in him. He came back to the United States and became, beyond any question, the most influential publisher of millions of words in hundreds of books, thousands of pages of newspapers and magazines, raising serious questions about whether or not the United States should have even been fighting Japan in the first place. And yet, if one of those bullets or one of those grenades had killed Willis Carto, I wonder if anybody else would have done it. I just wonder, you see. And that it all comes back to this point about the need for alternative media, the need for us to forget so many lies about 9/11 and about World War II and about World War I and about so many other things that we've been lied to about, because you can't look at it so selectively and say, well, yes, I believe the stories about World War II, but I don't believe the stories about 9/11. Or, you know, you can't pick and choose. You know, what do they call it? Cherry picking? You have to recall that it's the mass media we're dealing with. The mass media lies to you, and if they're lying to you about one thing, they're probably lying to you about other things. They very seldom tell the truth when it comes to the big, overreaching, overarching, overwhelming issues and events of our time. So I'll just leave you with that, folks. The media is the enemy. Thank you very much.